All right. And hello, everybody. Hope everybody watching this is having a wonderful and lovely day. Welcome back to U.S. History 1877 to the present. My name is Professor Ferrero. And last lecture, 6.5, we covered the start, the lead up to the U.S. entering World War II. We went over all of the factors that led up to it. We talked about the timeline, and we're going to pick up with the timeline today. So today, we're going to be focusing, similar to World War I, first on the war front, and then we're going to focus on the home front in the next lecture in 6.7. So with that being said, welcome to lecture 6.6, the European and Pacific fronts. So with all of that out of the way, we are going to briefly recap what we talked about last lecture. Quick reminder, these are our two teams. First is the Allied powers. This is going to be Great Britain, France, the USA, the Soviet Union, and China. If you remember, the USA and the Soviet Union, they both join relatively late to the party. Along with Great Britain, they do bring in the Greater Commonwealth and a lot of their colonies, and it is going to be posed against the Axis, which is going to be Nazi Germany led by Adolf Hitler, Fascist Italy led by Benito Mussolini, and military dictatorship that is Japan led by Hideki Tojo. Here's a brief timeline of what we talked about last class. This is a very quick TLDR. A lot of historians debate on when World War II actually started. I personally would argue that it would start in 1932 with Japan invading Manchuria, aka China, with the raping of Nanking. Next major event is going to be Hitler's invasion, the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938. Remember, Great Britain and France, they adopt the policy of appeasement, basically hoping if they give Hitler what he wants, everything's going to be fine. It does not end up fine. The war is officially going to kick off in Europe with the German invasion of Poland. Both the Nazis and the USSR, remember, they had both signed the Non-Aggression Pact, are going to invade Poland from both sides, officially kicking off World War II in Europe. Every historian agrees that World War II is in full swing by this point. By 1940, Germany had managed to blitzkrieg France, taking over all of it. Essentially, the European continent belongs to Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The only one really standing in their way is Great Britain. America, seeing the writing on the wall, starts prepping in 1940, and in 1941, they go ahead and they start putting in practical policies to help the Allied powers and take steps to hinder the Axis powers. In March, they are going to start the Lend-Lease Act, where they are going to be giving guns, weapons, munitions, and other supplies to the Allied powers, in particular Great Britain, what is left of France. Next, later that year, in July, they're going to place an embargo on Japanese oil. They know that Japan's war machine runs on its navy, and its navy runs on American oil, so they stop selling that oil to Japan. Later that year, Hitler is going to invade the USSR. He makes the exact same mistake that Napoleon makes. He's going to invade the USSR during the winter. And then the final event of 1941, the U.S. is going to join World War II after the Japanese surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. That is what is going to bring us up to today. So, here are going to be the three main Allied power leaders. These three men are going to be the primary reason that Adolf Hitler is going to lose the war. So from left to right, we have Joseph Stalin of the USSR. He is the communist leader of the Soviet Union. Next is going to be FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We've talked plenty about him, especially in our New Deal talks. And then finally, arguably the greatest British Prime Minister ever, Winston Churchill. He is going to lead Great Britain through probably one of its most trying, if not its most trying time in British history. He has to keep British morale up while they're getting firebombed by the Nazis day in and day out. I guess not technically firebombed, but still, even to this day, Great Britain is still finding undetonated bombs dropped by Germany in World War II. So, there's two fronts to World War II. There is the European front, aka the Western Front, and then there's going to be the Pacific Front, aka the Eastern Front. You'll sometimes hear it called the European Theater or the Pacific Theater. All of those mean the exact same thing. So let's deal with Europe first. By the time that the US joins the war, functionally all of continental Europe is controlled by Hitler. North Africa is almost entirely controlled by Benito Mussolini, and really, Great Britain is the only allied country left standing in Western Europe. Germany's been conducting air raids. They're basically bombing the hell out of Great Britain for months and months on end. Ultimately, the Allied powers are going to push in from three different directions. The British, the Americans, and what's left are going to push through France, moving from west to east. They're also going to push up through North Africa as well, through Italy, into southern Europe. Out in the east, the Soviet Union is going to push to Germany from the east. They're going to push in westward. And then finally, I guess this is what I was talking about at the beginning. Sorry for getting a little mixed up. The British, Americans, and what's again left of the French are going to push in through northern France into Germany. They are going to retake control of France from the Nazis in the largest military operation in history, D-Day. And they are going to all push in towards Nazi Germany, trying to take out Hitler. So it's important to note two really fundamental groups that are really important in World War II. It's going to be the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers. We're going to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen here first. The Tuskegee Airmen were a nearly all-black Air Force regiment. They started as a segregated unit, but they were some of the most talented pilots in American history, and as well as some of the most decorated men in military history. They were trained at the Tuskegee Airfield course, where 992 people or African Americans are going to graduate, and they are going to fly almost 1,600 missions. Their success rate is insane. They did a lot of escort missions, and they rarely ever lost anybody. They're some of the most talented pilots we have ever seen in American history, and I would argue that the success of the Tuskegee Airmen and really the work that African Americans do in World War II is going to be what helps push forward civil rights in the United States. These men are American heroes, and they're going to go out of the way to serve and die for a country that, while they know the ideas are good behind, they are not treated right here. That takes a certain level of humility and heroism and bravery that I don't think many people have. You can see how everybody is pushing in. The green line coming off from Great Britain, moving into France, is going to be the Normandy invasion. The Tuskegee Airmen, they're going to be moving in through North Africa up into Italy. Italy is going to lose to the Allies, and they are going to flip in favor of the Allied powers. If you look up who Italy sided with in World War II, sometimes they get listed with the Allies. It's because they flip. They're pretty fed up with Mussolini at this point, and they start siding with the Allies. The Russians are also going to be moving into Germany. They're going to be cutting through what is modern-day Poland and moving into Eastern Germany. So, this brings us to D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Allied forces are going to deploy off of the southern coast of Great Britain and launch to northern France, aka Normandy. This is the Normandy landing. It is going to be led by U.S. Supreme Commander of the Western Front, Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the largest seaborne invasion in world history. We're not just talking American history here. This is the largest seaborne invasion in all of world history. Over 156,000 Allied soldiers and another nearly 200 Navy men are going to storm the beaches that day. You have in total over 250,000 men in one naval invasion, and somehow the Nazis never find out about it. It was kept secret from Nazi intelligence. Nazi spies they were surprised by this. The Nazi soldiers on the beach were shocked whenever the invasion starts. They're going to push through northern France with invading forces coming up from the south, retaking the country. Ultimately, they would then go ahead and push into Germany, where the USSR would seize the capital coming from the east of Berlin. A total of 10,000 Allied troops are going to be a part of the casualties, and another 4,000 to 9,000 Axis troops. They're going to use over 5,000 ships and landing craft, 50,000 vehicles, and over 11,000 planes. Just on a technical level, D-Day was a planning masterpiece. There's never been a more complicated or more successful invasion than D-Day. That's why we still talk about it to this day. It's so incredibly well crafted. This is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's the Supreme Commander of the U.S. Allied Forces. He's also later going to go on to become president during the 1950s. Here we see Allied troops. This would be the view of you rushing out of one of the escort boats. You can see they're rushing towards the beaches, and you can see all the smoke up in the air. That's gunfire and sand being kicked up from the Nazi forces trying to stop the troops from retaking France. You can see them here trying to hide behind some level of cover from sniper fire. It looks like a couple of them may have been taken out. And again, here you see them trying to rush the beaches. They would be trying to take out Nazi sniper towers, Nazi watchtowers. I think it's also always important to remember too what's happening in the background of World War II, the Holocaust. During the early years of Hitler's control of Europe, he's going to have every single person of Jewish heritage register with the state. It's actually pretty brilliant what he does. He has everybody list, he has everybody register. That way he has a list of every single Jew who's living in Nazi-controlled territory. Later on, he's going to round them up and pack them up into cattle cars. They're going to be thrown in these cars for days on end, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people in one car, sharing a single bucket to use the restroom. They're shipped off to concentration camps, which again often took days. They're tired, they're hungry, they're stinky, they're smelly, they're disgusting because they've been cramped up in this cattle car, and all that they want to do is just get a hot meal and take a shower. Once they go ahead and they get to the concentration camps, they're going to be segregated by sex. So women are going to go one direction, men are going to go another. They're further shuttled into different showering rooms, and one of two things is going to come out: water or poison gas. Those that lived are now known by not their names, but a tattooed number on their arms. The Nazis intentionally stripped them of their identity and just boiled them down to a number. If you were too young, too old, or too weak to work, mostly men, elderly, and children, or not men, sorry, women, the elderly, and children, you're the ones that are most likely to get gassed. Those that were allowed to live were intentionally kept in a caloric deficit. They made sure not to feed them enough so that while they're doing manual labor for the Nazis, they're being slowly starved to death and worked until they can't work anymore. It is horrifying. Over 6 million Jews are going to be executed. To make matters worse, many Jews were trying to flee Europe during this time. However, other countries tried to stop them from leaving, including countries in the Middle East, and even the United States refused to take many of these Jews fleeing. It wouldn't be until after World War II that we realize how horrifying and evil this truly is. And it's not just the Jews who are targeted. The Romanis, the Gypsy people, are going to be targeted. Homosexuals are going to be targeted. They're going to be labeled not with a Star of David, but with a pink triangle. Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be targeted. The physically and mentally disabled are going to be targeted. And outspoken Catholics and Christians are also going to be targeted. In total, 6 million Jews are going to have their lives snuffed out, and 5 million non-Jews are going to be killed in the Holocaust. Their bodies aren't going to be buried, they're going to be burned in incinerators, leaving no evidence behind, or as little evidence as they could, of their lives. If you were one of the lucky ones who wasn't immediately gassed, there's a reasonable chance that the smoke you're seeing come up from the stacks are your family members, your friends, and your loved ones. Ultimately, Hitler did have a racial hierarchy, and he was working his way up the list. While people of African heritage weren't necessarily put in the concentration camps, they were targeted for forced sterilization, functionally genociding them as well, making sure that they can't reproduce for another generation. Again, it is truly horrifying. Here we see an image of a Holocaust survivor. It's the number that he was known by in the camps. The Star of David, a religious symbol for the Jews, was used as a marker before they were put into the concentration camps. People of Jewish heritage were forced to wear this around to identify to the police and to the people at large that they were of Jewish heritage. Here you can see the Jews and other people going to the detention camp, getting out of the cattle car. Realistically, you can see how many people were there, and all they're really going to want again is a meal and a shower, not knowing what lays ahead of them. Nobody knew about how bad the Holocaust truly was. And as the Nazi Empire was falling, as the Third Reich was falling, they're going to try and destroy as much of the evidence as they can, because they know how evil and horrific what they were doing was. Here you see a bunch of young Jewish children sitting behind a barbed wire fence. You can see a lot of them have lost quite a bit of weight already. And these are the incinerators that they would throw the bodies into. I think it's always important to remember that in history, we're looking at these massive numbers. We look at 6 million Jews. We look at 5.5 million others who were executed in the Holocaust. And to us, those are just numbers. Those are just numbers. But each and every single one of those numbers, just like you and just like me, had a dream, had a story to tell. They loved, they laughed, they cried, they ate, they slept, they wept. They, just like you and me, had a soul, and it was snuffed out. That easily could have been me and my mother and my sister and my wife and my father, and that easily could have been you and the ones you loved. They're not just numbers, they're people. And it's also important to remember, too, that the Nazis who did it, for as much monsters as they were in their hearts, were also human beings. That evil found in them lives in you, and it lives in me. Human beings are capable of doing amazing good, but they're also capable of doing such extraordinary evil, and the Holocaust really, truly goes to show that. So, the fall of the Third Reich. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is going to be May 8th, 1945. The USSR is going to make it to Berlin. Hitler is going to post up in a bunker and he is going to commit suicide as opposed to facing the consequences. The Nazis are again trying to destroy as much evidence as they possibly can of the Holocaust. And many Nazi scientists, shockingly enough, are going to be taken back to the US and to the USSR to work for them. Many of them actually end up being a part of the early space programs of both countries, including NASA. That whole thing, if you've seen Captain America and the Winter Soldier, where they bring Zola in and they have him work for the US, that really did happen. Stuff like that really did happen. The Nazi scientists, horrible, horrible human beings willing to do barbaric experiments on human beings. But the science that they did was, since there's no ethics, light years ahead of everybody else. Many other Nazis are going to flee to Latin America. However, a lot of them are eventually caught and put on trial. Ultimately, with the end of World War in Europe, Germany is going to be divided in half, eastern and western half. The capital itself is also going to be divided in half, eastern and west Berlin. It gets divided between the USSR and the West. East Germany is going to go to the USSR, and then the US, the UK, and France get West Germany. Basically, after this, Germany is going to get divided into two halves, a capitalist democratic side and then a communist totalitarian side. And you can see that here. Over on the far side, we have the Russian side, and over on the blue side, we have the ally powers, the democratic powers, Great Britain, France, and the United States. This is what Germany is going to look like for a solid, almost 50 years. It's going to look like this until 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we're going to pivot and talk about the Eastern Front now. The Eastern Front, for the most part, aka the Pacific Theater, is mostly just going to be the U.S. versus Japan. Early days of the war, the U.S. is going to suffer a lot of defeats. If you remember, the reason the U.S. got dragged into the war in the first place was Pearl Harbor, and their Navy, our Navy, is very, very far behind Japan's just in terms of raw strength because of how crippled it was after Pearl Harbor. However, the United States has a superpower. We are extremely geographically and in terms of natural resources just privileged. The U.S. industrial machine is able to outproduce the Japanese, and the U.S. is eventually going to catch up in terms of naval power. Where Japan can make 1 or 2 aircraft carriers a year, the United States can crank out like 5 to 7 in a single year. So they very quickly catch back up to the Japanese Navy and then quickly surpass them. Dwight D. Eisenhower's counterpart in the Pacific Theater is going to be a gentleman by the name of Douglas MacArthur. Originally, they're going to try and take every single island in the Pacific. However, they realize this is pretty unrealistic, so they come up with the idea of island hopping. They catch the most strategically important islands, trying to get closer and closer to Japan. The war would eventually turn in the U.S.'s favor with the Battle of Midway. Very, very fitting name because it's the turning point of the war. It's midway in the war, and quite literally, it is midway between Hawaii and Japan. So that's going to be June of 1942. There is General Douglas MacArthur. Very, very tall and imposing man. You'll see him in a picture later with the Japanese emperor, and he's just towers over him. So, this is going to lead us to the Bataan Death March. Shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 41, Japan is going to attack the Philippines in January of 42, and they're going to manage to take the archipelago in April of 42. Douglas MacArthur, who had been stationed in the Philippines for years, he absolutely loved the Philippines. He had a soft spot for them. MacArthur's a very interesting character in that he doesn't suffer from a lot of the racism of his time. He actually thinks that Asians are very, very competent and capable of defending themselves, things like that. MacArthur is going to be forced out of the Philippines, angrily shaking his fist, saying, "I came through and I shall return," basically telling the Japanese, "I'm coming back for you." And he does indeed return with a vengeance. Once the Japanese conquer the Philippines, they're going to force all of the US and Filipino troops to march 65 miles through tropical conditions and heat with no medical care. Roughly 75,000 were forced on the march, anywhere from which 5 to 18,000 Filipinos are going to die on the march, and anywhere from 500 to 650 Americans are going to die on the march. This is why it's known the Bataan Death March. They're marching to Bataan, and everybody's dying on the way because it's a tropical climate. They're getting to march through with basically no materials. You can see they're walking here with the dead bodies. Once located in Bataan, they were further brutalized and tortured. Again, everybody likes to remember how bad the Germans were in World War II, but the Japanese were nearly just as bad. Japanese officials involved with this event are eventually going to be charged with criminal war crimes. They were intentionally neglectful, cruel, and abusive on the march, not just to the Americans, but also to the Filipino people. You can see where they're marching here. They're marching from Capas down to Bataan and Manila Bay. This leads us to the second really important minority group that's going to help out in the war, the Navajo Code Talkers. So at the time, all of the messages flying around, it's going to be through radio, through the airwaves. The US keeps coming up with secret codes, and Japan just keeps cracking these codes due to the fact that they are all based off of language models that Japan is familiar with, whether it be European language models, other Asian language models. Japan's able to crack the codes. This is going to allow the Japanese to figure out American troop movements and get surprise attacks. This is where the Navajo Code Talkers come in. The Navajo are a Native American tribe. They're going to use their language, a language that the Japanese cannot crack because Native American languages develop independently from Afro-Eurasian languages. They're going to use key phrases to communicate, phrases that only the Navajo would know. So on one end, you would have a Navajo Code Talker giving instructions, and then on the other end, you'd have another Navajo Code Talker translating it for the troops that he's with. Ultimately, they're going to refer to things like tanks such as turtles in the Navajo language. Oftentimes, these Navajo Code Talkers, not oftentimes, all the time, they were paired with a radio technician who came with a firearm. Reason being is if the Navajo Code Talkers were ever caught, the radio technician was basically taught to kill them on sight. If they are getting caught by Japanese forces, it's a sad, tragic truth, but the Navajo Code Talker needs to be taken out. Because if the Japanese capture a Navajo Code Talker, they are going to go ahead and torture him and try to get him to break all of the secrets to decipher the code for the Japanese. So again, truly, we have another minority group who is facing a country who is discriminating against him, but he sees these men, they see the good in it, and they're willing to fight for it. Here you can see all of the battles, things like that. Not a whole lot to get to in here. You can see the Battle of Midway right here, partway between Hawaii and Japan. MacArthur is going to take back the Philippines. And yeah. So, the fall of Japan. The US is eventually going to manage to get close enough to attack Japan directly. They're going to start firebombing the hell out of Japan. Japan is still unwilling to surrender. They firebomb the countryside. They firebomb Tokyo. During this time frame, President FDR is actually going to pass away. And his VP, Harry Truman, is going to be put in office. The new president is going to be told, hey, the U.S. is making an atomic bomb. Truman, as vice president, didn't even know about the creation of the nuclear bomb. It was only privy to the president. Originally, the atomic bomb was being developed for the Nazis. The Nazis themselves were trying to develop an atomic bomb, but as opposed to risking more American and Japanese casualties on a land invasion, Truman is going to decide to use the bomb on Japan. Projections indicated that millions upon millions of Japanese would die in an invasion, and I believe at least 500,000, if not more. I haven't looked at the numbers in a long time. I apologize. 500,000, if not more, American soldiers would die if Japan was invaded. The Japanese were not going to go down peacefully. They were not willing to go down without a fight. Truman's also aware of the new rivalry coming on the scene between the U.S. and the USSR. If you looked over at Germany, Russia helped in the defeat of Germany, and because of that, they got a chunk of Germany. The U.S. does not want Russia to get a say in the rebuilding of Japan because Truman sees it on the walls already. The next fight is going to be between communist Russia and capitalist United States. They need to show the USSR that American military power. There's multiple reasons for the dropping of the bomb. End the war quickly, show Russia how powerful we are, and to get Japan to finally surrender because they are not willing to surrender. So, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before the atomic bomb, Tokyo and Japan, they had been being firebombed for months. 1/3 people are going to die in those firebombs. Japan still is refusing to surrender. The only other option is a land invasion. There we go. I put the numbers here. Sorry. Where it would cost 400 to 800,000 dead Americans and up to 5 to 10 million dead Japanese. Those were the projections. So with those options, Truman is going to decide that the better option is going to be to intimidate the Japanese by dropping the nuclear bombs on them. They dropped the Fatman and the Littleboy. Those are the names of the two nukes. Hiroshima is going to get attacked on August 6, 1945. 200,000 soldiers were killed, along with 70 to 126,000 civilians in this bombing. They intentionally made sure not to hit the biggest cities like Tokyo, but it was meant to make a point. Japan still refused to surrender, so a couple of days later, Nagasaki is going to be bombed on August 9th. At least 150 soldiers are killed and another 39 to 80,000 civilians. The second bomb is dropped to basically show them, we can keep doing this. Do not continue to fight. Japan is actually willing to continue to fight, not just after the first bomb, but after the second bomb. It's not until the Emperor of Japan steps up and tells his country, you need to stop this fight. This is not worth it, that Japan finally decides to surrender. The Emperor of Japan goes over Hideki Tojo, he goes over the military leaders, and he tells them you need to surrender. This is going to lead to VJ Day, or Victory Over Japan Day, on August 14th, 1945. Douglas MacArthur himself is going to be tasked with the rebuilding of Japan. Ultimately, he is going to choose to pardon the Emperor of Japan for his war crimes and commits to the rebuilding process. It's a very, very smart play. The fact that he pardons the Japanese emperor grants MacArthur and the Americans a lot of favor with the Japanese people. And ultimately, that's why Japan's such a big ally of the United States today. Here's the blast at Nagasaki. You might argue it may have been a necessary evil, but the deaths themselves, it doesn't wipe them away. Shadow people were left around the city. The area around where these people were bleached by the explosion, bleached by the light, and this is what all that was left. Here's the aftermath of Hiroshima. And then finally, we have a picture of Douglas MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito is going to be the one who says, we need to end this war. And with that, the Cold War is on the horizon. The US and Russia are really the only two major superpowers left standing in the war after the war's over. It's going to be the US versus the USSR. The next 50 years of US history are going to involve not a hot war, we never get into a direct fight with the USSR, but a Cold War of competition, of mistrust, of proxy wars, and suspicion between the two superpowers. So, well, World War II comes to an end and the most deadly and bloody war in human history finally comes to a close, we are going to be rolling up on the Cold War. That is where we are going to be ending today, and I will see you in the next lecture. If you have any questions, please go ahead and write them down. We'll go ahead and address them whenever we get to the next class. Next time, we're going to be going ahead and talking about the home front during World War II. If you don't have me for a class, please feel free to like and leave a comment with any questions you might have. I'll try and do my best to answer them. Take care and have a blessed day. Ferrero out.